what would you say is the most fascinating, terrifying, surprising, beautiful virus to you? So of all the viruses you looked at, sometimes when you just sit late at night with a glass of wine looking over the sunset, which virus do you think about?
So fulfilling all of those adjectives is hard, right? Fascinating, exciting, terrifying.
Well, the terrifying is an optional one, I think, because maybe that puts a lot of pressure.
I see terrifying is, to me, I'm not terrified because I think we can handle as most viruses, as you see with this brand new one that emerged a year ago, we can handle it.
From a virology perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the human perspective is a different story, right? That's always an issue. But so I think there are a couple of different categories of virus. So we could do the terrifying. And I think rabies is a terrifying virus because unless you're vaccinated, 100% certainty you're going to die. So you get bitten by a rabid raccoon or bat or dog, whatever, and there's still 70,000 deaths a year of rabies throughout the world because there are a lot of feral dogs running around that are infected. Unless you're vaccinated, you're going to die. There's nothing we can do. But we do have a vaccine which we can actually give you even after you've been bitten, which is the only vaccine that works that way. It's a therapeutic, right? It will treat your illness because the disease takes so long to develop. Eventually you get all kinds of neurological issues and paralysis and so forth. But it takes time, and you can be vaccinated, and it will prevent that in the meanwhile. So people always say, what's the most lethal virus? Is it Ebola? I said, no, it's actually rabies. Unless you're vaccinated, it will kill you.
But it's good to linger, because we'll talk about vaccines a few times today. Sure. It's good to linger on cases where vaccines have clearly, undoubtedly helped human civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like rabies is a good example.
Oh, rabies is great because everyone knows what happens when somebody gets rabies, right? You have fear of water, hydrophobia. Your body becomes spastic and stiff and jerks around, and you lose consciousness. You can't, no more.
It's not a fun ride to death.
It's horrible. It's a horrible way to die. So I think most people know that. It's been popularized enough in media, right? So then nobody would probably object to getting, I was just bit by this raccoon and it ran off. Okay, well, we should assume it's rabid. We should immunize you. And most people are okay with that.
Yeah.
Because they know the consequences. And it's also pretty rare, right? It's not like something that you're trying to get into the arms of, 250, 300 million Americans. That's hard. But yeah. the few thousand every year, it's easy.
So the transmissibility is difficult, right? It has to. Oh, it's not airborne. So
it's not airborne. It's just you have to be bitten. Although some people claim you could walk into a cave, and the bats, breathing out rabies virus could infect you. But I don't really think that's well substantiated.
Yeah,
I think it's a bite.
How would you do a study on that?
Yeah, it's very hard to do. You'd have to collect the vapors in the cave and show that they're infectious, and by the way, someone emailed me the other day, you'll like this. They say, why can't we just immunize all the bats in the world against these viruses? And I said, well, how would you do that? There are caves everywhere, right?
Yeah.
He said, well, maybe you could just go and aerosolize that.
Yeah.
It's pretty dangerous.
And then all the bats should have vaccine passports to make sure that they're
and I said you have to get their consent before you do it. But we do immunize wildlife against rabies. We have rabies vaccines for wild animals. There are a whole bunch of them that get rabies. And we put it in bait and drop it from helicopters in the woods, and it drops down the incidence of rabies in people.
Wow.
People hiking get bitten and so forth. It drops the incidence, so we can do that.
I didn't know that. I always wondered how much medical care we're doing for animals in the wild, because I've recently become more and more aware that animals are living in extreme poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, you don't know, you think like natural, it's great. Like when animals are living on a farm, It's terrible. But then you also have to compare to like what life is like or like the zoo. You have to compare what life is
Sure.
like in the wild.
Well,
And,
life in
and
the wild is very tough, I think. I mean, most animals have to, well, the carnivores anyway, they have to catch their food every day,
yeah.
right?
And then there's the viruses there.
They have
All,
viruses as well.
all
So
there's that.
the rabies immunization is the only one I'm aware of for wild animals. We do immunize lots of other animals. We immunize chickens and pigs and cows, even fish, farmed fish. You pick each fish up and give it an injection, when it's a small fish. But that's mostly so that the farmers get a good yield. We don't really care about the animals, right? We want a good yield for market. And then there's some examples where we immunize animals to prevent spillovers into people. So there's a disease called Hendra in Australia, which was discovered in the 90s. It turns out there are bats, fruit bats, that have this virus. And the bats are fine, but sometimes they fly into horse stalls and the horses get infected. These are, in Australia, it was initially race horses, which are very expensive, right? The horses got infected and they died, and the humans who would take care of them would die also. So now they immunize the horses to prevent to save the horses. Probably that's the motivation, because these horses are hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And then the people don't get sick because the horses don't get sick. You don't want to immunize all the people because it's too rare, but that approach is called the One World Health approach, which means everything's connected on the planet, and we have to think of everything in the grander scheme, not just us.
Yeah, so you can immunize some things along the trajectory that a virus would take.
Exactly.
So not some living beings. Yeah.
In the Arabian Peninsula, they have a MERS coronavirus issue. Every month there are a couple of cases where a camel will infect a human, and the human can get very sick. It's a respiratory disease, very, very much like COVID. And so camels are very common there. They're raced, they're used as pets, they're eaten. So there's a lot of human-camel contact, but the number of cases are rare, two a month. So you don't want to immunize all the humans. So the idea would be to immunize the camels. Mm-hmm. So
I like it. So, okay, so you put rabies, but Ebola also is a famously deadly one.
Right.
What is it? It kills 50, 60% of its...
Could be 50 to 90, but that's in Africa where the healthcare isn't great. What you saw when cases of Ebola came to the U.S., we could take care of it. We knew how to take care of it. We had fancy hospitals and so forth, and now we have a vaccine. So we can, and the vaccine is really good, but there are many governments in Africa that are suspicious of us, and they don't want to use our vaccine. So
there's a vaccine for Ebola.
There is, yeah.
And the effectiveness and safety of it, how much is understood?
So this is difficult because there's not a lot of Ebola, right? It's not a continuous ongoing thing. There are sporadic outbreaks here and there.
Of a few thousand people.
At most, usually a few hundred. And the biggest ever, in fact, this is why we didn't for years have an Ebola vaccine. The U.S. military, together with Canada, developed an Ebola vaccine for service people, right? They wanted to say, well, we're sending people into these Ebola areas. We want a vaccine for them. So they had developed it through all the preclinical, which means before it goes into people. And that stopped because there was no money to do a phase 1 and a phase 2 and a phase 3. In fact, for a phase 2 and 3, you need to have infections going on because you're looking at how well the vaccine prevents infections, right? So then there was a West African outbreak in 2013, 2015. The most cases ever, 25,000. So they got to test the vaccine. But they only put it in a few thousand people. It's not like it's been in hundreds of thousands of people like the COVID vaccines has been. So it looks like it has high efficacy, but we'd like to have more data. Side effects are not so great. There are a couple of different available vaccines. Some have been tested more than others. I would say this would probably not be widely accepted in the U.S.
But then neither would be something over 50% deadliness of a virus.
No, I think if you are, in fact, many physicians work in countries that have Ebola, so they get vaccinated because they understand the choice.
Yeah,
right?
right. It's always about the choice. So
So then one more thing to answer the
yeah.
interesting, what are some of the viruses you really are fascinated by? There are a number of viruses that have clearly been shown to alter host behavior, and that's how they spread.
Hmm.
I think those are fascinating. For example, there's some viruses of plants that are spread by aphids. And the aphid bites the plant, the virus reproduces in the plant, then it somehow engineers the plant to give off volatile organics to attract more aphids, which will spread the virus. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
So that's
Reminds
altering the
me of Twitter.
behavior. Altering because somehow the virus infecting the plant cells gives off these organics
So
and attracts
interesting.
aphids. And furthermore, somehow when the aphid bites, it tastes horrible. So they immediately leave with the virus they've just picked up and go to another plant to spread it. So they're attracted and then repulsed at the same time.
And obviously, you don't want to anthropomorphize this like a strategy they're taking on. Somehow this worked out.
It worked out this way. It just evolved. And evolution is sometimes hard to trace, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Darwin famously said, he could never figure out how an eye evolved from a single cell, right? But it did.
The more complicated, complex the holistic organism is that the virus invades, the less able it is to control that organism, right? So I wonder if there's viruses that can control human behavior, to induce more spread of the virus.
Well, I don't see why not.
There's not enough humans, I suppose, to like evolve through.
Well, we can't do the experiment to test it, right? We have to observe, and that's always hard when you're observing because there's so many things that can confound what you're looking at.
Change human behavior. Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things that impinge on our behavior, but I think it's possible. I think it's highly possible. If it does it in a plant, why not change some other organism's behavior? I think it's fine. Anyway, those fascinate me. There are lots of examples of those that are fascinating, and how they work, people are trying to figure out. But there's not a lot of money to work on, insect and plant viruses unless you're going to the USDA. So they don't get a lot of work moving forward.
Well, if you understand some of those viruses, is that transferable to human viruses? That understanding?
I think some of it could be, sure. I think the general principles, for example, how does the virus cause volatile organics to be made? It must be turning on some genes, and you could learn principles from that, how the virus might do that. Sure, I think everything is broadly applicable. So to say it's not useful to study viruses of insects and plants is just wrong, because in science, you probably know this, maybe in your field it's the same. If you're curious, you're going to run into interesting things that you never planned on, right?
That's why people, you can criticize, why do we want to go on Mars? Why do we want to colonize Mars? Well, it's like, why do you want to go to the moon? The reality is when you do really difficult things, engineering things, like all these inventions along the way are created. It's kind of fascinating how basically just pick a thing that everyone can agree is kind of cool and is really hard, and do that, and then you'll have like thousands of inventions that have nothing to do with the thing.
That's right. And I think you should let curious scientists just follow what they're interested in to a certain extent. You can't, in science we say we have translational research where we say, okay, here's some money, go cure cancer or diabetes or heart disease, whatever, right? And that's fine. But that often doesn't work out very well. What works better is to say, here you have a good lab, you have a good track record, here's some money, do something. And that's where PCR, CRISPR, recombinant DNA, all that stuff which has made the field explode, that's all it came from. Not from people saying, I want to cure genetic diseases by gene editing, but by saying, what are these repeated things in this bacterium doing? And